PhD in psychology in 2000. He was a faculty member at Mercer University in Macon, Georgia, before joining the faculty at Juniata College in 2004 as a member of the psychology department. After the terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001, he became interested in political psychology. His research focuses on understanding how liberal democratic norms are undermined by authoritarian ideology. His 20 published articles have been cited 800 times, and he is internationally respected as a scholar in authoritarianism. We welcome Professor Phil Dunwoody, and for this presentation he will be speaking for about 30 minutes to 40 minutes about his latest publication, and that will be followed by a discussion and question and answer session. Welcome, Professor Dunwoody.
Thank you. I'm not sure if people online can hear or not. You could maybe ask in the chat to see if people online can hear.
Okay.
I wanted to thank you everyone for coming. I know at least some of you I recognize some faces. I'm Dr. Phil is what everyone calls me. And I'm talking about authoritarianism research, which I became interested in really after 2001, the terrorist attacks of 2001 in the US, and looking at kind of the national reaction to those, and I'll talk a little bit about that. The talk I'm doing tonight is based off of a paper that I published with some colleagues who I want to first acknowledge. Joseph Gerstensen, Dennis Plain, and Tarita Upchurch Poole, who is here.
Oh, I am here.
Yeah, I enjoy very much collaborating with colleagues. It's always a good way to kind of put ideas out there. People push back, refine your ideas. I find that makes the process more engaging, more fun. And if you are interested in the longer, more academic, wonky version of this, you can read it and enjoy lots of statistical tables and whatnot. Okay, aren't too many stats, but some. So, all right, I mentioned that I became interested in authoritarianism after the 9/11 attacks in the U.S. And the reason was essentially this, was because after 9/11 happened in the U.S., there's a dramatic spike in hate crimes targeting Muslims in the U.S. So you can see here, this is FBI data, pre-9/11, 9/11 happens, you have a surge in hate crimes, and this particular data only goes out to 2016. If you project that out to where we are today, hate crimes directed at Muslims in the U.S. have still not returned to pre-9/11 levels, right? And this is 20-some years after the event, right? So part of what I've been interested in is kind of how the experience of threat results in people committing hate crimes or supporting policies that target others based on some identity characteristic, based on their immigration status, their religion, their skin color, some aspect of their identity, right? This focuses on Muslims, but if you look at kind of FBI hate crime data overall, you can see some trends, right? You can see a spike. This is starting in 2000. This goes up to 2020. You can see a spike in 2001, right, after the 9/11 attack. After the 9/11 attacks happened, and you can then see kind of a slow decline, right? And then you get to really 2015, 2016, right, which is the election of Donald Trump, and you start to see an increase, right? If you listen to hate groups, right, people who explicitly are kind of white supremacist, they will tell you that they very much support Donald Trump and believe that he was going to help bring what they wanted to fruition, right? So many of those groups felt empowered by his message
to act in ways that they hadn't previously, right? And this is something we kind of know about prejudice and acts of discrimination. And many people might have some thoughts, but they often won't act on them because they perceive the social norm as not allowing it. And many people saw the election of Donald Trump as a sign that it was now okay to act on those things, right? And you see this kind of continued rise, right? 2020, the last presidential election, a lot of anti-immigrant rhetoric, anti-Asian rhetoric around COVID, right? We saw a spike in hate crimes targeting Asian Americans around COVID. We also then had terrorist attacks in Paris that got a lot of press. That was, well, I guess that was actually 2016 that happened, right? But these things, they come up in the news, people consume that news, right? And then how do they respond? How do they react, right? And this is part of what I'm interested in, right? And then it's also part of what I'm interested in, right? Related to this, right? So if you think of kind of extremist behavior, broadly speaking, right? We have a democratic election, and Donald Trump essentially refuses to acknowledge the results of the election, right? That's within his right to do, to challenge it legally, right? He does, puts many lawsuits forward in federal courts related to the election, almost all of which are thrown out because of lack of evidence, right? So he's got a claim that the election is stolen. He repeats that over and over. It's become known as the big lie, right? But even federal judges appointed by Donald Trump throw out the lawsuits because of lack of evidence, right? So now the amazing part about this is if you look at polling data still today, 70% of Republicans believe that Donald Trump won the election, right? That's remarkable, right? So no real evidence that the election was stolen other than his repeating it over and over, and then a media system being also willing kind of to essentially amplify that propaganda, right? So if a leader, someone in power says something, it doesn't influence people unless there are others willing to repeat it and amplify that message, right? This is kind of a pattern we've seen in hate crimes and genocide across countries, across incidents. All right. So what happens here is somewhat really predictable, right? Because you have someone who's denied an election, talked about the threat that Democrats represent, the threat that even his own vice president represented, right? Who really works up his followers, and the predictable outcome is violence, is political violence, right? So a little bit what I'm going to talk to you about tonight. What is authoritarianism? Right, this thing that I do research in and have been for some time. What is the fascist authoritarian model of illiberal democracy? Right, I should have thought of a shorter title for that. Abbreviated as FAMIT, right? This is the model that actually I'm talking about tonight that we developed and tested in the paper I referenced, right? I'm going to talk about how it's kind of a departure from previous models of authoritarianism. Then how do we test it and what did we find, right? So at any point, feel free to raise your hand and ask a question, by the way. I mean, I've got this to about 30 minutes on my end, but you don't need to wait to ask questions. First, talk about what is authoritarianism and where did this literature come from, at least in psychology, right? I'm a psychologist, social psychologist, and the first publication that most psychologists point to would be 1941, Erich Fromm's research or book, Escape from Freedom, where he's really looking at the rise of the Nazi movement in Germany, right? In the Weimar Republic, and the movement of that republic into then a fascist state, an authoritarian state, right? In 1951, the authoritarian personality comes out, which is the first attempt to try and measure authoritarianism as an individual trait, as a personality trait. And there was really a whole bunch of research. This is just one example, right, in authoritarianism of looking at kind of what happened in Nazi Germany and trying to understand what happened. How do we prevent it from happening again, right? How does the Weimar Republic was a modern democracy. It had a constitution that was modeled after the US Constitution, had an LGBTQ rights movement, was really a very liberal, well-educated state, well-functioning democracy that then descended into, you know, what we now know as Nazism, right? How is that possible? 1981, Bob Altmaier publishes Right-Wing Authoritarianism, which is really an attempt to kind of revise the theory, focus it a little bit more, looking at prejudice, people's willingness to target others based on identity characteristics, but also support for kind of a strong man leader, right? And someone who will do what needs to be done and crush the troublemakers in our society, right? There's a lot of other research, but I want to talk about some of the commonalities in this, right? In this authoritarianism research. So one is this idea of focusing on the individual, right? Looking at authoritarianism as a trait, right? Something that resides in a person, that is different across individuals, relatively stable and measurable. When we say a trait, that's what we mean, right? If it's not relatively stable across time, it's not a trait, right? You talk introversion, extroversion as an example, right? The big five personality inventory is another example, right? These are traits. So sometimes authoritarianism has been described as a personality trait. Sometimes it's been described as a cluster of social attitudes, and sometimes as a set of values or an expression of values, right? All of which are still considered traits. Your values don't change day to day, right? Your personality doesn't change day to day. It's relatively stable. Okay. I like to think of authoritarianism as an ideology. I think that's a better way to look at it than a personality variable. And by ideology, I'm quoting Jost here, a belief system of the individual that is typically shared with an identifiable group and that organizes, motivates, and gives meaning to political behavior, broadly construed. Okay. Another way to think of that is a set of beliefs about how the social world is organized and ought to be organized. And so a belief about how our world is structured and how it ought to be structured. And when there's a perceived mismatch, people are motivated then to try and move the way it is to the way they think it ought to be. Okay. And if you read any political ideology, whether you're talking kind of mainstream republicanism or Democrats, or even extremist ideology, you'll still find this, right? There'll be some picture about how they view the world, right? And then some idea of how they think it ought to be operating, right? And that's what kind of drives their behavior. And then authoritarianism has always been, right, the goal is always to explain certain behaviors, right? This is what we do as psychologists. We want to explain a certain behavior. Coming out of World War II, right, Nazi Germany, the focus was really on understanding what causes prejudice and discrimination, right? That's really the main goal. That is also now political intolerance, which is essentially well, I should have rights because of my beliefs, but if your beliefs differ from mine, then maybe you don't deserve the same rights. That's an example of political intolerance, right? We're always tolerant of people who agree with us, right? But real tolerance is actually acknowledging that someone else has a right to express things that are quite different than you and actually opposed to what you believe, right? Support for violence against outgroups, right? This is where I started. The hate crimes, right? This is one thing that this research is very much focused on. Sometimes it looks at support for war, support for strong man leaders, right? Who kind of represent this almost alpha male stereotype. And another commonality is that it's really, when I talk about authoritarianism, some people think of an authoritarian leader, but this research is really focused on following behavior. Right, which is to say, so an authoritarian leader says stuff, But what causes you as an individual to find that receptive, right? Because if I say something and no one listens to it, it doesn't matter, right? So the focus is kind of on individuals and why are they susceptible to it, right? And very much at this individual level. As researchers, as psychologists, really what we do is behavioral attribution, right? We study behavior and we try and understand the cause of behavior, right? So, and research on behavioral attribution really kind of breaks that down. We can either attribute behavior to something that resides in the person, a trait, right? Or something that resides in the situation, the environment, the context, or some combination, right? I'll tell you, as you know, if you get asked a question like, is it nature or nurture? The answer is always both, right? And in this case, the answer is always both, right? We're trying to understand prejudice, discrimination, hate crime behavior. It's really both of these things, right? What research on human judgment has found is that people, especially in Western societies, have a strong tendency to attribute the cause of a behavior to individual traits and to ignore or neglect the power of the context in shaping behavior. Okay. We think of ourselves as individuals, we think of ourselves as responsible for our own behavior. And the idea that things in the environment might be driving our behavior is not something we're used to thinking about, right? And there's a whole bunch of research showing that this is very typical in Western societies, right? And when the research first came out, they said, actually, this is just a human tendency. Humans all across the world tend to see a behavior and blame something in the individual. So you think, you're driving in traffic, someone cuts you off. Your first thought isn't, I bet they're really stressed out because of all this traffic. Right? Your first thought isn't about the context. Your first thought is that jerk, right? You blame the individual, right? Now, the irony of that initial research is actually to show this actually is so common, it's got a name, the fundamental attribution error, right? This is considered an error in human reasoning that we do all the time. And the research itself is actually a bit of an error because over time, what we learn is that this is true in Western societies that have a very individualistic ethos, but not so much in more collectivistic societies. You can present the same scenario to people in East Asian societies, for example, or from the US. And people in the US are very quick to talk about the individual and how their desires, their intelligence, something about them is what caused it. And people from China or Japan are much more likely to talk about the environment, right? And social pressure and expectations, right? So I guess what I'm arguing is that research in authoritarianism has done this same thing, right? And that we've looked at a certain behavior and we've really focused on this, right? And have not spent enough time thinking about the context, okay? Which isn't to say we haven't spent any time on it, right? So Karen Stenner, Mark Hetherington, others, Stanley Feldman, John Duckett, a number of people have looked at authoritarianism and threat and how those two things relate. And threat is described in a number of different ways, but some of it can be economic threat. You get into a period of economic instability, people feel threatened. Or there's a flood of immigration, people feel threatened, right? And so that's an example of this kind of more contextual look, right? So I'm really trying to help shift the question further in that direction. And instead of just saying, why do people find authoritarianism appealing, right? Which kind of leads to these trait-based responses. It's like, how do authoritarian leaders use the information environment to create an authoritarian movement? Right? That's a different perspective. Okay. And I think it's one that forces you to widen your lens a little bit in trying to explain prejudice, discrimination, hate crimes. So one of the best books books on this that I would recommend you reading if you want to know about kind of modern authoritarian fascist movements is How Fascism Works by Jason Stanley. He's a political philosopher from Yale, or currently at Yale. It says fascism, he uses fascism and authoritarianism synonymously, says that in the book. He has another book called How Propaganda Works. It's a fairly short read, right? This is a popular press book. And he looks at Hungary, he looks at Poland, he looks at Nazi Germany, he looks at the US, right? And says, we look across these contexts, what do we see in common, right? In authoritarian movements, in fascist movements. And this is what he points to, right? There's a romanticization, it romanticizes the past, okay? Traditional cultural practices, and if you think of Donald Trump's slogan, "Make America Great Again," right? "Make America Great" refers back to kind of this lost time when things were great historically, right? This previous time, right? It views others as threatening, right? Immigrants, minorities. When Donald Trump announced his presidency in 2016, his run for presidency, he started by talking about Mexicans coming to the US who were rapists, drug dealers, and thugs. Right? His initial message was essentially one about threatening others. That was literally how he announced his presidential campaign, right, on day one. These others are viewed as threatening, sometimes because they threaten traditions, right? If you believe that traditional cultural values are really important, and you have new groups coming in with different traditions, that can be experienced as threatening. Sometimes they're viewed as biologically inferior, right? And having immigrants come in essentially dilutes the purity of the group, right? And that's seen as problematic, okay? And you can see this in right-wing extremist movements today in the US. If you read their literature, they absolutely talk about this stuff today, right? And it uses propaganda to motivate followers by emphasizing the threat caused by others, right? And the need to take action, right? If you feel really threatened, if I can make you feel threatened, then you're gonna be motivated to do something about it. And then I can direct you in the direction I think you should go to do something about it, right? And typically these are ethno-national movements, right? And what I mean by that is that there is a joining of the nation state with an ethnic racial group, right? So the most obvious example of this is Nazi Germany, right? Where you have the belief that essentially, right, the German state and a certain ethnic racial identity are one and the same, right? And the purity of the race is very, very important for the protection of the state and the nation, okay? And this is why you also saw very prominent white supremacist groups, including members of the KKK and other white supremacist groups, being very vocally supportive of Donald Trump as soon as he announced his candidacy. They view those as the same, right? As one and the same, essentially ethno-nationalists. Okay. Another book that was influential in kind of thinking about this for me was The Constitution of Knowledge by Jonathan Rauch. And this looks really at what he calls an epistemic crisis in the US. He talks a lot about the use of Russian propaganda techniques in the US, right? And there's a technique called the fire hose of falsehoods that is really attributed to Putin largely, right? I'll say if you rewind some before the internet era, it's fairly easy for an authoritarian to control information flow, right? You can control the newspapers and you can control television fairly easily, right? Once you get the internet, that becomes much more difficult. You can't control everything on it. You can try, which is what China is trying to do with the Great Firewall, right? But it's challenging, right? So if you can't control all the information, what do? Well, you flood it. You flood it with so much falsehood that people can't tell fact from fiction, right? You have your facts, we have our facts. Who knows what's true, right? And to quote Steve Bannon, who was one of Trump's political strategists, he says, the real opposition is the media. And the way to deal with them is to flood the zone with shit, right? And so this is a very deliberate tactic to say, you know, truth is kind of an obstacle. If I want to be an authoritarian leader and have you believe whatever I say, then I have to find a way to kind of discredit other things in your information environment. And one way is to just flood it, right? To just overwhelm it with false information. Right? One of the things that research has found, for example, is that false information spreads much faster on social media than true information. Okay, there's a good bit of research on this, right? So it's our social media environments are actually wonderful for spreading misinformation. They work better at that than they do for spreading truth. That's rather problematic, but it's how they currently work. Doesn't mean they have to work that way in the future, but that is the way they're set up currently. Okay, so I mentioned this fascist authoritarian model of the illiberal democracy, right? Family for short. Basically what I'm saying, if we want to understand what I'm going to call illiberal anti-democratic practices, right? So illiberal refers to freedom or lack of freedom, and anti-democratic practices, right? So things that curtail individual freedom and interfere with democracy. We really have to talk not just about authoritarianism as a trait, but how threat othering is done, how people are deliberately made out and exaggerated to be more threatening than they are, right? And the use of propaganda, conspiracy-oriented propaganda in that. So, for you Juniata students, many of you have taken scientific process classes, I would hope at this point, or maybe a social inquiry class, right? And so these are our ways of knowing, right? And the way that science works, whether you're talking natural science or social science, is that we create a model or theory, those words are used interchangeably, about how we think some part of the world works. It could be part of the social world, part of the natural world, doesn't really matter, right? We create a model about how we think it works. And then we collect data to test that, right? We make hypotheses about what our data should say, right? Based on the model. And then if the data supports our prediction, then the confidence in our theory and model go up. And if not, we make changes to it, right? This is a never-ending process. This is the scientific process, right? So, all right, so how do we collect data here, right? So we've got 500 plus participants in our survey, students, faculty, staff, and administration at a couple of different colleges, universities, in several places across the US. You can see it leans towards students, primarily students, more female, predominantly white, and a liberal bias, right? So I'm not claiming that the sample is representative of a US sample. It is not. It is a convenient sample. It's a good size convenient sample, but it is not a representative one, right? That allows me to test relationships between variables, but I can't really make assertions about how common these things are in the US population because our sample is not representative of the US population. Okay, authoritarianism is measured via a scale that I created, and it's really about a belief in traditional social norms, a belief that those who deviate from those should be severely punished, and that people should blindly trust authorities, particularly their in-group authorities, right? And so if you're on the left, that means you trust the authorities on the left. If you're on the right, that means you trust authorities on the right. You're not necessarily going to trust each other's authorities, right? You may not even view them as legitimate authorities, right? Which is what we see a little bit of happening today. Threat, what I refer to as threat othering, right? Because often a message is that a group is threatening and that is delivered over and over again. And so othering creates this kind of fear of this other group, right? And how dangerous they are and that they must be dealt with. And we asked a number of questions about this. We asked questions about how threatening people are who are promoting COVID masks and vaccines, or people who are opposing them. I asked both those questions. We asked questions about how threatening were Democrats in how they handled the 2020 election. Essentially, how concerned are you in terms of how Democrats handled the election? Or how concerned are you that Republicans handled the election? Everyone got both of those, right? And then we asked a pretty wide variety of conspiracy-oriented propaganda beliefs, some related to Black Lives Matter, most of them focused on COVID and the 2020 election, partially because of the timing of our data collection. Just to give you some examples, right? Bill Gates has promoted the distribution of COVID vaccine for sinister reasons. COVID may have been created by the pharmaceutical companies as a way to profit from the vaccine. President Trump really won the 2020 presidential election. Most college and university professors are communists and anarchists who hate America. Members of Antifa were involved in the January 6th attack at the US Capitol. These are all things you can find online. I didn't make these things up, I just looked them up, right? So, and then we looked at kind of these illiberal anti-democratic tendencies, which are really support for targeting some group based on their identity characteristic, right? Trying to limit their rights in some way, or either implicitly or explicitly supporting violence against them, right? And again, this is really what I want to understand, right? So the idea that so we broke these into actually right-leaning and left-leaning, because we're trying to look actually both at illiberal beliefs of the left and illiberal beliefs of the right, right? So right-leaning, like the idea that the January 6th activities at the US Capitol were justified, essentially support for the attack on the Capitol, the insurrection. Believe that violence may be necessary to stop the left from using COVID as a tool to destroy our country. This collected last year. There was still more resistance about masks and vaccines. We're in a different place today. Teaching about critical race theory or systemic racism should be illegal, right? That's a big topic during the election. Still a big topic, but it's dropped off some. Left-leaning and liberal anti-democratic attitudes, right? Here's some sample items. Those who refuse to wear masks have relinquished the right to live freely in the United States. At some point, it may be necessary to stop the right-wing threat to our country by force. Those who support Donald Trump should not be allowed to vote, right? Not advocating any of these on either side, just so you know, right? These are examples of what I think are actually bad things, okay? All right, so now's the fun part. We get into a little bit of statistics, yes?
So when you talk about reality-based professions, does that refer to the questions about the trust in college professors?
No, that was a whole separate, smaller scale that I'm actually not talking about here. It's in the paper, Trust in Reality-Based Professions. Was it on the slide or?
No, it was not.
Okay, yeah, so I didn't include that in this, just to make it a little bit shorter and tighter, honestly. That is used to predict still the same list of illiberal anti-democratic practices, but is a separate scale. Okay, so how well did the model work at predicting the data, right? Can we predict illiberal anti-democratic practices from using authoritarianism, some measures of threat, and conspiracy-oriented propaganda? Well, first, we looked at illiberal anti-democratic practices as a group. In other words, ignoring whether they were left-leaning or right-leaning, okay? Just lump them all together. And the first model here, I have a pointer here. The first model, what you see is that we can predict essentially 19% of the variance in responses based on threat and authoritarianism. And a good bit of previous research has shown that those two are quite predictive of illiberal tendencies, right? So these are regression weights, standardized regression weights. They can be interpreted somewhat like correlations, right? In that higher numbers mean a more powerful relationship. And so you can look at these and see that the threat numbers are a little bit higher than the authoritarianism number. They're all statistically significant in helping kind of predict support for illiberal tendencies. If we look at right-leaning anti-democratic attitudes, let me back up. Model 2 adds conspiracy-oriented propaganda and kind of asks, how much of a boost in predictive validity do we get by adding that? And when we add that to the model, we go from explaining 19% of the variance to 33%, essentially a third. It's not bad in social science, right? If we go to looking at right-leaning anti-democratic attitudes, we see that authoritarianism and threat can explain about 39% of the variance, right? So that's a better model when we're explaining right-wing extremist beliefs. And then when we add conspiracy-oriented propaganda, that jumps up to 54% of the variance. That's a pretty big jump. We're now explaining over half the variance in people's responses. The model's doing a very good job in understanding right-wing illiberal practices. If we look at left-wing, we're explaining 28% of it, and almost all of it is really from threat. The perception that Republicans are threatening, okay? Not from authoritarianism. And the addition of conspiracy-oriented propaganda, even though some of those were left-wing type beliefs, doesn't add anything to the model. Right, not really useful. Okay, so big picture, right? Some things we also saw in comparing Republicans and Democrats in our sample. Republicans had higher scores on authoritarianism, higher scores on conspiracy-oriented propaganda, and general illiberal anti-democratic practices than Democrats did. Conservative self-identity is correlated with support for right-leaning illiberal anti-democratic attitudes. This is not surprising, right? If you're on the right, you might support more extremist right-wing actions. If you're on the left, you're more likely to support left-wing extremist actions. And the correlation is the same, essentially. So being on the right leads you to about the same amount of support for right-wing extremism as being on the left does for left-wing extremism, right? Interestingly, though, support for left and right-leaning illiberal anti-democratic practices, they're not correlated at all, right? So it's not a general support for punishing people. It's specifically support for punishing the other, right? Famine does a better job at predicting right-leaning illiberal anti-democratic attitudes than left-leaning ones, right, by a long shot. We see right-leaning attitudes really heavily influenced by conspiracy theories. Okay, you know, Trump's big lie that he promoted, right? There was all kinds of conspiracy theories related to that got a lot of traction in right-wing media, right? Left-leaning illiberal anti-democratic tendencies are really driven by the belief that the right is a threat to democracy in some way, right? And then to kind of generally support the model, to understand support for these illiberal anti-democratic tendencies, all of these components are necessary, and I think important when you think about authoritarianism. Now, how is it that a state might devolve from a liberal democracy to an authoritarian state, right? It's not just something that's a trait that resides in the person. It's something deliberate that's created in the information environment, right? That helps radicalize people, right? And the increasing belief that our fellow citizens are threats to us. Right? That is what promotes and justifies violence against them. Okay. All right, so some statements on the future of democracy, and then I'm going to stop for questions. Politics in the US has been on an increasingly polarized trajectory for a number of decades now. And what we have also seen during that time is an increase in political violence, right? And no real indication that that is changing. Right? I wish I had a more positive message there, but the likelihood based on our current trajectory is that we are likely going to see more political violence in the future, right? Now I'm going to argue against that a little bit and say, if you look at the most recent election, Republican election deniers, which were people who were largely adopting conspiracy-oriented propaganda, actually did a lot worse than other Republicans, by and large, right? And Trump-backed Republicans did much worse than non-Trump-backed Republicans, right? And Trump's really big test was he would back you if you said that he won the election. That was his main criteria, right? And so this is what authoritarianism is about, right? I assert something, and what's required of you is just to agree. And as long as you do that, you're in my circle, right? And for that to be effective, right, there's different ways, right? I can essentially talk about how the media can't be trusted, academics can't be trusted, right? You shouldn't listen to anyone but me, right? And that's how we get to essentially January 6th, right? And then something I've been concerned about, since really Trump came onto the scene. I was studying authoritarianism before Trump came onto the scene, right? And my concern once he did was not so much Trump, but the Republican Party, okay? Because so many Republicans, when forced to choose between pushing against some of Donald Trump's lies or keeping their power in the Republican Party, chose to protect their butt rather than to stand up for what's true, right? So Liz Cheney would be an exception, right? Over and over again, what we saw during Trump's presidency was more moderate Republicans actually being pushed out of the party, and the Republican Party really drifting in an extremist illiberal direction, right? So there's really a little bit of a civil war going on in the Republican Party right now, because so many Trump-backed candidates did so poorly in the last election, right? This most recent one, and now Trump has announced that he's running for 2024. Right? What's going to happen? Who's going to be nominated? Right? Is it going to be the Trump wing, or are we going to see kind of a return of more traditional conservatism, right? Which is very different than Trumpism, right? So with that, I just want to again thank my co-authors for their awesome work in this, Dr. Poole included. And open it up for questions.
Very good.
Stop sharing this, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. What questions do you have? Yeah, Sean.
So I understand that the reason why you decided to focus on both right and left wing anti-democratic attitudes, illiberal anti-democratic attitudes, is because of critiques of former studies that only focused on right-wing illiberal anti-democratic attitudes. That's kind of long.
Yes, it is.
I was wondering, so I know you decided to use questions about mask mandates and COVID policies because that's such a relevant issue. I was wondering, and as you predicted, those in that model, the right-wing attitudes, I would say attitudes were more associated with the conspiracy theories and the truth delegitimization compared to the threat perception. I was wondering if you were to do a study, instead of using those COVID questions, you used questions about school shootings.
Right.
And that because school shootings are more of a, I would argue, is more of a general sort of truth legitimization by both parties. Do you think there would be you think that truth delegitimization would be stronger associated with even left-leaning attitudes compared to this study? Because
because that tends to be an issue more of the political left.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. The issues you look at matter, right? And so that's a good question, right? So we only ever know the questions we put on our surveys and not the ones we don't, right? So follow-up study that we can design maybe next semester, right? Because Sean's going to be doing research with Dr. Poole and I on this. Yeah, looking at school shootings and kind of support for kind of gun regulation, right? And how far do you take that on kind of if you want to go on a left-wing extreme side? Possibly that, just to talk about you know, Sean has mentioned the truth delegitimization, which I didn't really talk about in this. For propaganda to be effective, right? Part of what you have to do is discredit people who are referred to as in reality-based professions, right? So you think, what's the job of a journalist? And the job of a journalist is to try and to give you their best understanding of the truth. Now, do they have bias? Of course, we all have bias. None of us are bias-free, right? But there's a code of ethics. There are all kinds of ways to check there. And if something is wrong, they try and redact it. And you know, this is where you have kind of news agencies hopefully have some who have a long-standing reputation, right, as being credible. Scientists, academics, right, are in the job of trying to understand what is true, right? And so if you want propaganda to flourish, right, if you want to be able to assert whatever you want and not have anyone disagree, you have to discredit those groups, right? Which is something Trump did very effectively from the very beginning, right? He went after the media, right? Repeatedly talked about them as threatening, liars, horrible people, right? He would say this at his rallies and get chants, right, on a regular basis. He would talk about judges, right? And again, you know, that the judges serve as part of a check and balance in the American legal system, right, to executive power. The media is part of that, right? Freedom of the press is there because the part of the press's job is to call out government abuse and abuses of power, right? And so if you don't want to be restrained in any way, you have to find a way to kind of discredit these groups who really have it as their job to try and promote our best understanding of the truth, right? And one way is to just paint them as enemies, make them appear as threatening, right? This threat othering. Other questions?
I have a couple of questions from the chat.
Yes.
Got it. Okay. One question, and you pretty much touched on it, is how important is the presence of an other? The Jews in Germany or the LIBS today, how has that affected the environment in Hungary or Brazil?
Yeah, so I mean, I think authoritarians require an other. And if there isn't one easily present, they'll create one, right? So, you know, I think an authoritarian leader wants to amass unchecked power. And part of how that is done is to say, what we're facing is so dangerous and threatening that you need to give me a bunch of power to do whatever I need to do right now, right? That's part of the argument. And so, yeah, so a dangerous other is absolutely needed, right?
Mm-hmm.
So anyone who is an other can be made to look dangerous, right? This is the thing, right? And this is what happened to the Jews, right, in Nazi Germany. And you still see this in if you look at kind of conspiracy propaganda today, there's still a threat of, so for example, one of the, there was the shooting in the synagogue in Pittsburgh, right? The mass shooting. And that person went in there because they had been reading conspiracy-oriented propaganda on the internet that said that the migrants that were coming up from Central and South America into the US were being funded by George Soros, who is a Jewish billionaire, right? So there's still this kind of anti-Semitic conspiracy, right? So that was part of that. And I mean, I think Trump was actually asked about that. And he said, well, I don't know if it's true or not, but it wouldn't surprise me if it was, right? Which is a way of saying like, well, I'm not going to say it's true, but it might be true, right? And as president, wow, that's a powerful message, right? Yeah, so yes, it's absolutely essential.
Yeah.
Right. Other questions? Yeah.
questions.
Yeah, I got a few questions if no one wants to ask. But
Let me just give you the microphone.
sure.
So I know you mentioned that traditionally these illiberal, anti-democratic, authoritarian leaders use the spread of misinformation, the fact that there's like alternate version of truth. So how do they like establish themselves as proponents of the truth when what they say is that there is no version of truth? Like how do they reconcile the misinformation with that there is only one version of truth and that there can only be one version of truth and that is like them?
Yeah, I don't say that there is, I don't know that they say there is no truth, right? They essentially say their truth is the right one, right? I mean, you're right, sometimes it's not always internally consistent if you listen to what they say, right? You know, Kellyanne Conway, when asked about facts that she was putting out under the Trump administration, said essentially, well, you have your facts, we have our facts, right? Which is kind of what you're referring to, this idea that there are multiple facts. And just sometimes that is true, right? You know, sometimes there are two different sides of a story. But sometimes one of them is just fiction, right? And so the official one of the leader is the one that is promoted by the authoritarian, and the other ones are just kind of dismissed, right? As not true, as part of a conspiracy, right? So even the idea of global warming, some people talk about global warming as this left-wing conspiracy by scientists across the planet, right? Who I'm not sure what they're trying to do, but they're trying to do something, right? And that it's not really happening, right? And so it's this left-wing conspiracy, and therefore we can ignore or should ignore kind of everyone talking about climate change and climate science because they're all really involved in a conspiracy to end capitalism or something, right? And part of it is that I think there's enough support for the idea of democracy that authoritarian leaders, at least in it depends on the country, right? But let's say in the U.S., what you would really want for an authoritarian system to work, there would have to be the illusion of democracy, right? Which is what Donald Trump tried to do, right? They tried to get fake electors sent from states to challenge the legitimate electors in the Electoral College. It wouldn't have worked to just say, well, I lost the election, but I want to remain president anyway, right? Instead, you have to assert a fiction, which is that, no, I didn't lose the election, right? And this is why I didn't actually lose the election. And let me throw out all these kind of, as soon as I throw up one fiction that's knocked down, I just throw up another one. And that gets knocked down, but I've already thrown up 10 more, and you can't even clean up, right? The news media had a very difficult time fact checking. They couldn't fact check fast enough for the falsehoods that were coming out and how quickly they were spreading on social media. Elliot.
So thank you so much, Phil, also. I've got a question that I'm not sure exactly how you can answer it.
Yeah.
So I'm just going to kind of throw it out there and let you work with it. But when I'm online, let's say a few years ago, I'm on Yahoo News, and I'm reading different material that's coming out, and there are these comments that are coming, and those comments are coming faster and faster and faster. And those comments seem to be part of the environment, the circumstance that you're saying that can potentially create authoritarianism.
Mm-hmm.
At the same time, you have a news site like Yahoo, which, to their investors wants to say, we have this many people actively on the website. And there's this sort of wrapped into some kind of capitalism and market. And that seems like, to me, a very dangerous circumstance. And I just want you to comment on that and how that might play into this.
Yeah, so I mean, I hear, if hopefully I'm rewording your question accurately, is kind of what's the relationship between, in a way, that the amplification of threat and maybe misinformation in a for-profit news business,
in which that kind of misinformation is the monetarily, you have no interest in reducing it.
Yeah, right. So if you, the misinformation spreads, like we said, faster than true information on social media. And the social media platforms have taken the stance that they are essentially, they are not willing to, at least initially, their stances were that we are not going to try and police the information for any truth, right? In the way a newspaper would, right? Historically, right? Newspapers do this. Even for profit, CBS, NBC, ABC, there's still certain ethical standards of journalism, right? And so while they may sensationalize things because they want you to watch, right? And that drives up profits, there's still, though, they view it as their job to prevent false information from being presented on their show, right? And Google and Yahoo and Facebook, they all explicitly said in the beginning, that is not our job. We are not going to police anything on our platforms, right? Well, this is just a free information, kind of a libertarian information environment. But we're going to profit off of it greatly, right? And yeah, to your point, it wasn't really in their best interest monetarily, right? Now, if you think that they're members of a democratic society and should care about the well-being of that society, right? I'd say they had actually some ethical obligations there that they were not overlooking, or that they were overlooking, right? But it was profit-wise, it wasn't convenient for them to do so. I mean, Facebook is a great example of this. The Russian government, through its propaganda outlets, were creating fake Facebook pages, essentially whose only goal was to sow political dissent in America, right? So the largest Black Lives Matter Facebook group at one point was actually a Russian Facebook front, right? And then at the same time, that same Russian organization was promoting a Blue Lives Matter pro-cop Facebook group, right? They had no interest in which side, right? All they wanted was essentially for us to be fighting ourselves, right? And so quite successful, it worked. And Facebook essentially just, was willing to take the Russian money, right, for those services, the Russian government money, without any real repercussions. Right, and that's why you now have kind of Congress and whatnot really just tried to push a little bit more. Now, how well that will work, we will see, right? I mean, you have, right, this whole thing with Twitter, right? In that, of course, right, they were trying to regulate hate speech more. And of course, Twitter, right, famously took Donald Trump down after the January 6th insurrection and said, we're not going to give him that platform because he has used it to promote violence. And Elon Musk has said, last at least I heard, he changes his mind pretty regularly, but that he was going to give that platform back, right? That Donald Trump would have his Twitter handle back, right? So yeah, so what is the role in these organizations in promoting a civil discourse that is actually promotes a peaceful democracy, right? We're going to have disagreements. We should have disagreements. We should also be working to resolve those in a way that's peaceful, right?
I just thought of something. I guess we did a research idea.
Okay.
I'm always thinking about research. So I hear you saying, Elliot, is there a relationship between an organization's or an entity's ability to monetize our attention through propaganda, and does that drive what's happening with this authoritarian behavior? So in a social media site, what they're trying to do is monetize your attention, and they do that by letting all kinds of stuff flow, and it's very emotional.
Yeah.
So if a site is really good at that, can we measure, the monetization of attention by looking at, I mentioned this to you before, the quality of propaganda is very emotion-based.
Yeah, right.
And so do we see that having an effect? So the site just kind of lets it be there, but people aren't really commenting much and things like that, you don't get that attention, right? So social media sites are vying for your attention and it's not really about communicating with others, it's your attention. Does it make it anything there?
Right.
Anything there.
Right. And what grabs attention, right? So we are, as animals, hardwired to pay attention to threatening stuff. It's a survival mechanism. Every animal does it, right? We're also hardwired to pay attention to sex, right? And so these two things are very prominent in our media environments because in a way we can't help but pay attention to them, right? We're evolved animals that respond to sexual signals, that respond to potential threats, and they know that, and they use it to monetize, right, our attention.
The other thing I was going to ask you to say something about, Dr. Dunley, is threat. So in your current work and the stuff that we did we look at threat generally, or do you think it's possible that we can unpack, subdivide threat? So I'm thinking of like Susan Fisk and core motives, and so people have these basic, underlying needs, or need for competence, need to feel secure, monetarily and all that.
Right.
So can we subdivide threat? So I'm wondering if we broke down threat into sort of categories, if we would see people respond the same way. So if you feel threatened about losing resources, or losing your partner, or losing your home, or different kinds of, losing a sense of competence or autonomy, would differentiating type of threat make a difference?
It's a good question. I mean, because you can talk about lots of different types of threat. I mean, existential threat, right? And epistemic threat. And the way we have asked these questions in here is always about a group, right? So how concerned are you that, for example, Mexican immigrants are taking resources away from Americans in need, right? That's a resource threat. Are dangerous to you and your loved ones, right? That's a physical threat. Or are dangerous to traditional American values, right? Which is more of a culture threat. Those are the three I have focused on. I've always measured them in questions that are right next to each other. And so if someone responds high in one, they always respond high on the others. But if those questions are separated out, it may be they can be teased apart better. So what I've looked at so far is suggested that if people view, for example, Mexican immigrants as threatening in one category, they view them as threatening in every category. They don't really distinguish between this. They're just, you are just threatening, period. It doesn't matter why you ask me, you're threatening. And that might get to more of your affect, right? I just experience you as threatening. And how does it? Yes, you're just threatening, period.
There's one more from the.
One more from online?
Yes, and actually it has one part is a statement or opinion and the other is a question. The first part is, my theory is that Trump started his presidential campaign as a joke. And then in parentheses, he was trying to make money. And then the question is, why would authoritarianism be profitable?
Oh, gosh. Well, I mean, authoritarian leaders usually use the power of the state to enrich themselves, right? So this is again the role of checks and balances. The role of the media is to try and prevent corruption, right? Corruption is a threat to a democratic state, right? So so who knows? Well, I'm not going to speak to what his motives were for running initially. I don't know, right? I think, people often use their positions of power, and I would say this across political parties, to try and enrich themselves, right? I think that is a human tendency, unfortunately. And this is why you need transparency and checks and balances in the media to try and check that tendency. Sure.
Let me just remember my question real quick. So regarding the topic of perceived threat, I was wondering about the case of school shootings and how both sides sensation. I don't think this mic is working, but
I turned it off. Rest of it.
Push it up.
So as through misinformation, both left and the right put use these perceived threats towards, you know, our families and our children's,
Mhm.
to exaggerate the threat of school shootings, even though, you know, the government, FBI has all put out, you know, statements that school shootings are an issue, but they're, you know, the rate of them is falling and our schools are getting safer and safer. So I was wondering, what does the, what do each of the sides, the left and the right, benefit from sensationalizing the threat of school shootings, and how do they differentiate from each other?
I'm not, yes, I'd have to think about that. I'm not sure. Well, I think is your question assuming that both sides do sensationalize them? I mean, I think the argument on the right has been that what stops a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun, right? And so it acknowledges the threat, but essentially says the way you deal with that is by arming other people who can stop that, right? So I don't, yeah, I'm not sure if that's sensationalizing it or not. And you know, and is news coverage, I mean, what does it mean to sensationalize, right? Is news coverage of a school shooting necessarily sensational? I mean, it's a pretty horrible event, right? And so I think they should be covered. How they should be covered is an important question. It's a tougher one. So I think I'm dodging your question a little bit.
The topic that is not.
Well, it's you'd say how they're using those things politically, right? I mean, when they happen, you know, Democrats talk about gun control and wanting to pass gun control election, and then Republicans accuse Democrats of using the school shooting to talk about gun control and essentially making it political, right? And that's to use the word political as though it's a bad thing, and I know that's often how that word is used, but to discuss public policy is political, and we should all be political in a way. We should be discussing public policy and how to make our place a better place, right? Yeah, so the left and the right, of course, have very different stances on gun violence, and I'll say, you know, if you look at the hate crimes, you know, what you do see. Why you see kind of tendencies to silence, and you might say left and right-wing authoritarianism on both sides, and you can see violence on both sides. You see more violent action on the political right, and this is something the FBI has tracked for some time, right? The FBI has talked about right-wing militias as one of the top national security threats for decades. That's not new, right? And part of what they do, of course, is militia training, right? Is military type training. And many of them are ex-military. Yes.
So you mentioned that right-wing groups are more likely to be violent. Do you know why that is versus like left-wing groups?
It's a good question, right? So I think I'll say that's in a US context, which is not to say it will be true in other, right? So I think the US politics tends to lean right compared to, for example, Europe or Asia, which leans more in a moderate or left direction. And that's all a question of where do you think the center is, right? It's all a relative thing. But I think part of what we might see happening and what we might see happening in the future, as these instances of right-wing violence happen, January 6th being an example, are we going to see a counter to that more left-wing violence, right? Because as we see right-wing violence, well, that's going to be perceived by the left as threatening, right? And we know threat tends to result in support for more violence, right? So that may be, right, that's the danger, right, is that both sides amplify and you wind up with more violence on the left and the right, which I think we should avoid, just to be clear. Okay. All right, one last one, Sean. One last question. You get the closing question.
Semester next semester.
So I saw that on Professor Nagast's door. His prediction is that in the next 50 years, the U.S. will be in an authoritarian regime due to social media. So what are your thoughts on that?
It depends, right? So unconstrained social media in many countries, US just being one of them, has been a source of political instability, right? So I do think it is important to talk about ethical guidelines in the same way that the news media has ethical guidelines, and to talk about what we know certain types of speech promote violence, right? And what obligations do these platforms have for monitoring that, right? And the freedom of speech laws apply to government silencing people, right? Which is different than individual organizations deciding to regulate speech, right? So Twitter, for example, could ban Trump, and that's not a First Amendment violation. It's not a free speech violation, right? Because it's not the government doing it, right? So I do think there's some really hard questions there, right? That the U.S. laws around free speech are really, really strong because, right, and very different, for example, than Germany, right, today. So in Germany today, you can't buy Nazi propaganda, right? It's illegal because they saw where that went, right? But you can in the U.S. And not only can you, but you can't have laws restricting it, right? So how that's going to play, I'm not a lawyer, right? But how that's going to play out in terms of what regulations are permissible given constitutional protection on free speech, which is something I think we should absolutely value, right? I mean, you give the government to regulate who can say what, and that can be very dangerous power for governments, right? There's a long history of governments abusing that. On the other hand, if people can say whatever they want, they can use free speech to undermine the very foundations of government and democracy itself, right? This is what Karl Popper talks about, the paradox of tolerance, right? He says that if you truly value tolerance in a society, the one thing you have to be intolerant of is intolerance, right? Because people will use the mechanisms of tolerance to undermine the foundations, right? This is what both the Nazi and the Communist Party were doing in Weimar Germany. They were using their kind of their rights of free speech to undermine government stability, right, and peace, right? And so these are hard questions. I don't have easy answers.
Could you clarify? That's a good question. I want to just ask this really quick. So you said it's about government regulating speech and things, but that does not mean an entity that is not a government entity cannot have regulations or guidelines.
They can, absolutely.
So for instance, at Juniata,
right,
you could say that we're a community that does value, opportunity to hear different beliefs and things like that. But at the same time, we don't allow people to go around writing the N-word or using these swastikas. We can absolutely say that. And we're in no way saying that is not a violation of freedom of speech. So when people say, well, you're taking away my first right, my First Amendment right to put this swastika, that's not the same. That's not the same as government saying, you can't buy this propaganda. You can, but we as a community can say, we don't want that.
Yeah, it really plays out if you look at public versus private universities, right? So let's say a white supremacist group wanted to rent out Neff Hall or A100 and spread their white supremacist message. Juniata is a private institution. Juniata can say no, right? A state school cannot, right? Or it's a little more complicated. Again, I'm not a lawyer, right? But the but they can't regulate speech on their campuses in the same way that a private school can because of that public-private distinction, because a state school is government, right? And government has very limited ability to restrict speech, where Juniata is private. So yeah, so Twitter is private, right? It is not a government agency.
Sorry.
Yeah.
You're making it longer and longer, I guess, but I was just, I'm not sure if this is even directly related, but I was just thinking how culturally thought and action is considered, like differently or similar to each other. Again, like I'm not a lawyer either, but for example, when somebody is creating a project that has royalty rights, if they didn't put anything into action and they just spoke, they cannot claim any rights.
Can you give an example that makes it more
So like,
concrete?
let's say you and I develop a project and
Yeah.
we talk about it.
Yeah.
And then I take that idea and I put it into an action,
Okay.
and there's a product
Okay.
that comes out of it. And you didn't do any research, I took care of everything.
Right.
Although the key idea came from you,
Right.
you just talked about it.
Yeah.
Or you talked about part of it, I still own it because you didn't do anything. You
Right.
just spoke about it.
Right.
So, I mean, this also goes into like written thought and just spoken thought. And how are those related to action?
Mhm.
And where is law exactly?
Right.
In this case, and I wonder if, like, in different cultures, probably the idea and the connection between idea, thought, and action are set differently.
Ah, okay. Right.
Yeah, so I was just thinking out loud. So this is not really a question.
Right. No, but yeah, that, where is that separation between thought and action? And how explicit,
and how
right?
can law get into the picture
Yeah.
and say something or do something or take action?
Right. I mean, and this is, with hate speech, right? The regulations, you can essentially say that a group is dangerous, that a group is threatening, that it would be better if they didn't exist. All of those things are legal, right? In the US anyway, right? You can't explicitly say people should go out and kill members of this group, right? That's where the line is. So you can hint, you can make a very strong case, you can make your intention clear and still not step over that bar, right? That line for in terms of free speech, and so that it's not, you're not inciting violence in a way that is kind of clear and eminent, if the language is something like that. So yeah, but that is, you're right, it is very different from culture to culture, country to country in terms of how that is treated. Yeah, and that is, I think stems from the part of the US's history in terms of breaking away from Great Britain and concerns about government power, right? And a real attempt to limit government power to protect individual liberty, right? And I think that's generally a good thing, right? But then that necessarily confines what government can do, right? Related to liberty. And so, where is that balance when it comes to things that promote hate speech, right? So because it is legal for people to say many things that we know increase the likelihood of hate crimes. And should it be, right? I mean, where should that line be, right? And that gives both an ethical and legal question, right? This is a good audience, and y'all are hanging around and asking good questions. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you so much, Professor Dunwoody, for this very rich and enlightening presentation. I have so much that I'm going to talk to you about this. And but I really appreciate the audience, appreciate everyone for your good questions and good engagement here. And thank you, Professor Darwali, one more time. Thank you.
All right, thank you, everyone. I encourage you, talk with people who you disagree with politically, understand where they're coming from, and don't just other them.
That's right.
Good night.